Hi everyone, I'm Augusta Vivian, CEO of Higson, and joining us today is Matthew Owen, Director of Cool Earth, to discuss what outcomes the world needs from COP26. Cool Earth is a charity that works with rainforest communities to halt deforestation and its impact on climate change, and is one of Higson's charity partners. Higson provides free of charge training workshops to improve pitches, team communication, leadership skills, and donates 15% of our profit to support the incredible work that Cool Earth do. So Matthew, let's jump straight in. What actually is COP26? Why is it so important?
Well, where do we start with that? Okay, so COP, Conference of the Parties, which is an odd acronym. Everyone assumes that it has climate in it. It doesn't, and there are lots of conferences of the parties, but this is a particularly important one because it's focusing on actions by the international community to address the climate crisis. You have them every year. 26, there have been 26 of them, so it's not going too well. I think everyone admits that we're running out of rope, and therefore this one is extraordinarily important because it's been recognised by everyone from the US to China to Russia that unless some global agreements are made in the very near future, we are on the path to not plus 1.5, not plus 2, probably plus 3.7 at the worst case. So, it is terrifying. The problem, of course, with all these things is there's a huge amount of political posturing. Some people aren't turning up. Some people aren't even agreeing the rules of the game. So, it's easy to be very, very pessimistic about what will actually come out of COP. But Cool Earth, as always, realises that pessimism is, a fool's charter because it just means that action isn't taken. So what we do is very much focus on the positives, the things that can be done, and really just try and boil down some very simple messages for everyone to do. Individuals are important, companies are far more important, nations are the most important. So we've really just got to focus on what they do.
Yeah, it's so important, isn't it? And I think that's so true about the negative. We all have that negativity bias and we tune into the negative, and it is pretty negative. Yes. And actually also what's really important is what's positive. So what are your hopes? What are we going to hopefully get out of COP26?
Okay, so we could talk about this for about 6.5 hours.
Yeah.
not shed a great deal of light. So let's
boil it down.
Really simple messages. Methane, the gas that no one really talks about, it comes from lots of industrial processes, a lot of agriculture, from cows, from fertilizer and the like. The weird thing about methane is that it is a very potent greenhouse gas. So it actually stores more heat than CO2, carbon dioxide, about 10 times more. The good news is it only lasts for about 10 years. But it means that actually, if we were to address a huge number of the methane emissions, we can actually buy us a great deal more time and reduce the heating a lot more quicker than if we address CO2, which, as we'll get on to, lasts a great deal longer in the atmosphere. So just addressing methane is the big one. And if we were to reduce it by about 45%, which I won't go into the dull numbers, but is not a hugely expensive thing to do. It's really just, in many cases, covering up leaks on existing pipes in oil and gas infrastructure. Then we can probably, reduce heating by about 0.3 degrees. Doesn't sound like a lot, but really will make a huge contribution. So methane is up there. The second one that we need to do in this sort of triumvirate of priorities is forests, which we'll talk about far more. But basically, the destruction of forests and, related land use change throws about 6 billion tons of CO2 into the atmosphere each year. Put that into context. Globally, we're putting 43 billion tons. So 6 is, it's not the biggest. I mean, transport, energy are bigger. But this is a really interesting one because it doesn't have an infrastructure behind it. It doesn't have a huge amount of invested capital that will have a depreciation cycle that will carry on and carry on and carry on for 10 years. This is, in many cases, a market failure. People are chopping down forests because it has no value standing and it has a great deal of value cut down. So just addressing that one, and we have some great ideas that I'm sure we'll get onto, is a priority. And then the final one is coal. Coal, we shouldn't be burning coal. We have better technologies. It's a simple one to replace. And the really interesting thing we need to address at COP is that we have actually new coal plants in the pipes. They haven't even, broken ground, but people are planning them. Just saying we're not going to build any more coal power stations. We'll do an enormous amount. And coal at the moment is producing about 10 billion tons of that 43. Wow. So it's a huge priority. So, electric cars, photovoltaics, all those things. I mean, lovely things we can talk about, but actually methane, forest, coal. That's what we need to get out of this COP.
3 key messages, keeping it really simple and actually can have a huge impact, as you say. You were saying there about the value of forests and the value of trees. I know we are going to talk a little bit more about Cool Earth and your work. It is really interesting that we were having a great conversation last time about the value of trees and how, because they've been so devalued, cutting them down and then their value later on. Can you share more about that? 'Cause I think that's really interesting.
Absolutely. So trees are a big chunk of the carbon cycle. They are one of the key carbon sinks in the globe. The other key one is really the oceans, which also absorb a huge amount of CO2. But if we didn't have those carbon sinks, then the doubling of carbon concentrations that we've seen since the Industrial Revolution, so literally twice as much carbon in the atmosphere, would actually be more than times 4. We'd have quadrupled, and it would be game over for the planet, or well, not for the planet will always bounce back, but it'd be game over for humanity. Huge swathes of India, China, Central America will just be uninhabitable if it weren't for these sinks. So actually keeping them in place is absolutely critical. And the thing that always comes back to us at Cool Earth and our partners in tropical forests from Papua New Guinea to Peru is that actually protecting them is a very straightforward thing to do if you align priorities correctly. And the thing that we keep on being reminded by is that there are lots of ways to protect forests. You can put fences around them, you can cover them in signs, do not touch. It doesn't really work. The thing that works is people who live there, and they've lived there for generations, just being in control of them. And if you look everywhere in the world, from the Congo to Indonesia and Malaysia and South America and Central America and Papua New Guinea, local people being in control of their forest has better conservation outcomes, better emission reduction outcomes than anything else we can think of. And it's not really on the table. It's often talked about, it's often flagged, but it's such an obvious priority for the global community that we just bang on and on and on about it because it really does work. We don't just lobby about it, we don't advocate about it, we also put money in the hands of local people. And the simple model that Cool Earth as a charity has is that putting money in the hands of people who have a great record of protecting rainforests is a great way of protecting rainforests. Simple as that.
Yeah, it comes down to that human being. Sometimes we can stand so far away from a rainforest and make all these ideas and thoughts and fences and signs, like you said, and actually that's not going to work. What's going to work is really empowering individuals who live there to protect the rainforest and make it valuable for them. And that's something that you do as well, which is amazing. You mentioned when you were talking there, you mentioned carbon sinks. I know that's something that not everyone, I wasn't familiar with before. I wonder if you can just explain a bit about what we mean about carbon sinks and why they're so important.
Okay, so there are lots of biological processes that use carbon. Plankton in the oceans breathe it in and absorb it and turn it into their skeletons. And when they die, it sinks to the bottom of the ocean. It's a great way of storing carbon. Trees also inhale carbon dioxide, normally during the night, exhale oxygen during the day. And the C bit of the CO2 that they keep, they turn into carbohydrates, which is their twigs, their leaves, their trunks, their roots. And when those leaves fall to the ground, they get turned into soils, and those soils can build up. Anyway, it's a great way of storing carbon, and it's not just an important way of storing carbon. All those things I refer to, the breathing out of the oxygen, but also the breathing out of the oxygen that then turns into water, are critical cycles that we all depend on. So these are not just important sinks or stores, they're also very, very important mechanisms within biological cycles that keep us all alive. Destroying those, therefore, is utter madness. It's almost as if we've been given a get out of jail card by our planets, and we're just tossing them into a fire every time we get them at our round. And the more we do that, the more we'll see these critical sinks, which have been great absorbers of carbon for so long, and as I say, have absorbed more than half of the CO2 that we've emitted through oil and gas and coal. They'll become actual emitters themselves, and that will mean that the sort of the rapid pace that we've seen as we move towards a far more warming climate will turn into something that's even faster. And that will mean that the 2030s and the 2050s that politicians are so obsessed on, fixated with achieving something by 2050, will be even more meaningless, because 2035 it will be game over.
Yeah, it's kind of terrifying when you think about it like that.
Terrifying.
It's so yeah, it is. It's terrifying. And so essentially, the carbon sink is taking the carbon and sinking it. And so one of the things I know that many companies look at and we talk about is offsetting our carbon. So going and planting new rainforests. So I know that's something that you think is a whole load of rubbish. So why don't we talk about offsetting?
Yeah, no. I'll try. I do. I mean, you're adding probably more nuance than I normally do. It is rubbish for lots of reasons. I mean, offsetting is in theory a lovely idea. So you go in your private jet, or you burn a huge amount of coal, or you destroy forests, and you say, well, that's awful. I'll tell you what. While I'm doing all these dreadful acts, I will protect forests on the other side of the world. I will plant trees in the north of England. I will do things which are regarded as therefore positive, and this will offset my bad behaviour. The trouble is, we really can't afford this luxury of business as usual with the idea that we're doing something good on the other side of the planet, because we're in such a, I mean, to put it bluntly, we're in such a pickle that we need to do a great deal more than just, keeping business as usual. By all means, protect rainforests. And I know we will talk more about it and how Cool Earth works. But at the end of the day, doing that, thinking that you're offsetting, malignant bad behavior here, just means that malignant bad behavior lasts for longer. And we actually need to recognize that if we're driving a car 1,000 miles a year, don't offset it with some tree planting. Stop driving 1,000 miles a year, because you probably don't need to. And the last 18 months have shown us that we can do extraordinary things in our lives that can lower our own personal carbon footprints dramatically. But more importantly, at the national scale and the corporate scale, there are huge numbers of things that can be done, and can be done quite quickly and with relatively small investments, which are going to get far better returns for the planet and for the company than spending a bit of cash on planting trees on the other side of the world. The other thing to bear in mind, and I'm going to get technical here, is that if you plant a tree, you'll get a certificate from an offset company, and they'll say, well done, this is great news.
Pat on the back.
Thank you from the bottom of our hearts. And we'll tell you that tree is going to definitely be around for 30 years' time. Isn't that great? I mean, 2 points with that. The first 30 years of a tree growing don't actually absorb a great deal of carbon. I mean, 30-year-old trees, they're great, but a 30-year-old oak compared to a 1,000-year-old oak is very, very different. The real problem, though, is that after 30 years, there's probably no guarantee that that tree will be looked after and protected. It may well be logged. It may well be killed by, the climate crisis and global heating. Who knows? But the CO2 that you've emitted because you're planting this tree will be hanging around for not just 10 years or 50 years, anything up to 400, 800 years even. CO2 is an incredibly persistent gas in the atmosphere. So there's no way that we can easily kind of offset it with these, as they say, nature-based solutions in a credible manner. And doing it just, basically pulls the wool over everyone's eyes and blunts us from, what we should be focused on, namely just reducing our own damn emissions.
I love what you said as well around that if you are planting and offsetting by planting these trees, you're potentially more likely to carry on doing it and even do more of those behaviors because you're feeling good about the and so actually taking that away. You shared a story before about a really nice image about the acorn and how long it grows and how long it takes.
Okay, so going back to my point that CO2, carbon dioxide, is a very persistent gas in the atmosphere, and therefore it can hang around there for 800 years plus. If you wanted to therefore to have planted a tree that's been absorbing carbon and remaining in place for 800 years, then you probably had to be standing to one side at the signing of the Magna Carta, pushing an acorn into the ground, and then somehow finding your descendants or someone else to protect that tree for 800 years. Now, I think we'd all agree that is not a costless exercise. And yet, when you look at a ton of CO2 being protected in a tree planting offset, for example, I mean, you can get that for less than $1 a ton. It's madness, absolute madness. And it's no surprise, therefore, that people, rather than retrofit something that avoids leakage of methane on their oil refinery, will potentially buy a lot of offsets. And it just doesn't make any sense at all. And we need to recognise that this, peculiar fiction that's emerged over the last 20 years needs to be dismissed as fiction. By all means, plant trees. It's a great thing to do, and the Cool Earth are delighted to be part of the Queen's Green Canopy, which is planting literally millions of trees across the UK over the next 18 months. Marvellous thing to do, but please don't think that somehow means that we can forget that our laser-focused priority must be reducing carbon emissions from transport and from energy.
Yeah, so it's still brilliant to plant trees, but don't fool yourself that that's an offset of any kind. It's planting trees and cutting down your emissions, both in...
Absolutely.
Yeah. And one of the things you mentioned as well there around governments and companies and corporations, what is it that they should be doing? And then how can individuals play a part in this, or are we too small really at this point?
It's a really interesting point, and there is a lot of debate that actually the focus that many companies want to encourage individuals to take is a bit of a red herring. And as consumers, there's not a huge amount we can do. That is wrong. We can do things, but I would also say that the things that we can do as consumers are nothing compared to what government and the corporate sector can do. So, for example, as individuals living in the UK, our two biggest emissions of CO2 will be related probably to transport and heating our homes. That's almost guaranteed. And in terms of the options we have for heating our homes differently, there are it's ridiculous. In 2021, we're talking about hydrogen and air source heat pumps and ground source almost for the first time, and those will be technologies that will come in probably over the next decade. And some of it will take longer than that. And the idea that our gas infrastructure will be retired very quickly and we'll move over from natural gas to hydrogen is a nonsense. And therefore, the thing that we have to do first and foremost is, I'm afraid, insulate. Very boring, very cost effective. And that's generally, finding ways in which we can just avoid heat escaping from our house is the number one priority we should all be doing. In terms of transport, again, we've managed to stop using transport in an amazing number of ways over the last 18 months. And we just need to say, do we need to have 3 flights a year? Do we need to drive, 10,000 miles a year? Do we need to have 2 cars in the household? Can we move to EV? Can we move to electric vehicles? That is an option that, I agree they're very expensive and, they're out of reach of many. But if you're able to do it, you really should be doing it because it's a kind of a no-brainer. So there are things that consumers can do. And without a doubt, we should do them. But we really should be training our sites on the actions that government take, which in many cases look great, have a lot of flannel behind them, but really don't recognise that they have to force behavioural change on consumers, because consumers at the moment just don't have the options that are available. And therefore, the huge amounts of money that have gone into subsidising the oil and gas industry over the last 50 years, we really need to recognise that it needs to be at least the same amount that goes into decarbonising our economies.
There are a few things there, Matthew, you said that are really interesting to pull out. The first is that idea about, insulating our house. It's not very sexy. Actually, what we love is a big ribbon, and we cut a ribbon and it's something new. And essentially, anything that you're opening and cutting a ribbon on is probably quite a lot of carbon because it's something new. Whereas what we really need to do by the sounds of it is, really think about what is there already, insulating, changing light bulbs globally, not, TfL across their whole system type thing, not just one individual light bulb in your house.
Absolutely. No, and it's as you say, it's unsexy, but it's cheap, and actually we can do it. Secondary glazing, loft insulation, wall insulation. These are things that we all probably need to do unless you live in a new build, because Britain has amongst the oldest and the crappiest housing stock in Europe. And as such, there's a to-do list for all of us. But as you say, we have companies that have 2.5 million electric outlets, use of sockets, use of light bulbs, for them not to have changed it. And I think probably most of them have. But then they need to recognise that where are they getting their energy from? What investments do they need to make in their capital expenditure, expectations over the next 20 years that will ensure that, they really have retired all of their carbon emissions in a scale that's probably not 20 years, but 5 years.
Yeah, so important. one of the other things you said there as well around travel, and the world has taught us in the last few years that we don't need to travel as much as we perhaps were, and flying there for a meeting. Crazy to think that now, that you can get on Zoom and have incredible conversations. And I know you went to a conference, didn't you? And you did the whole route by trains and ferries, and just being really conscious of your travel. And that is something that companies really need to promote more, rather than encouraging someone to fly over to a meeting.
Yes. No, it's a really good point. And I did go to a conference, and it took getting on for 18 hours to get there instead of 2. And I had a lot of reading opportunities. But at the end of the day, I mean, it was lovely to see people, but it wasn't necessary. And we're getting better and better at Zoom. We've got to recognise that Zoom and all the other platforms are going to get extraordinary. I mean, what we're using at the moment is just so basic. It's basically Skype, but within, I can imagine, 2 to 3 years. This will look as though 19th century in terms of the conferencing options we have. So yeah, travel for those sort of things won't be different. And I also don't buy the idea that we need to be there in person. It's great to be there in person, but actually what we found in Cool Earth, it's great to be there in person. It's great to have everyone on Zoom as well. The worst thing is a hybrid of the two. A few people in the room, a few people coming in, and we haven't quite cracked that yet. That's the big challenge for us to get that right as well.
That's a challenge that's coming up for quite a lot of our clients, is how do we have these hybrid meetings, and something that we're trying to help with. We've got a few ideas, can discuss that separately. But what is Cool Earth going to be talking about at COP26?
Well, a lot of people are feeling a bit pessimistic about this COP. We're going to inject some much needed optimism, not because we have a huge amount of faith in world leaders, not because we have a huge amount of faith that the discussions behind closed doors will, change policies and expectations for everyone. It's because on the ground, particularly in tropical rainforests, we have incredible individuals, incredible families, incredible communities that are already doing a terrific job of keeping that forest standing. And as I said, unless we keep these critical carbon sinks in play and intact, then the wriggle room that we think we have going forward is massively constrained. So we have stories from Cesar Bustamante in Peru, who will be talking to us about what the Ashanika communities are doing to protect their rainforests. We're going to be talking about school children from Papua New Guinea and what they do to understand better for themselves, but also for all of us, exactly the services that the rainforest provides. And I hope with our campaign, which is basically 100 reasons to be climate optimistic, we'll be suggesting that it's not yet game over. We can keep 1.5 degrees and that target alive as a possibility. But we do need to recognise that huge things has to be done in the transport and the energy systems. We do need to decarbonise. But first and foremost, and number one on the to-do list, is to keep those carbon sinks intact. And the most important one for us are the tropical rainforests.
Absolutely. They're there already, protecting them, getting the individuals on the ground interested and passionate, which they already are and want to be if they're given that, as you say, empowering them. And that's what's so amazing about Cool Earth, is it's all connected. And maybe just tell us a bit more about Cool Earth and how it all works with the individuals and the rainforest, and how it all links to you being over here in the UK. Tell us a bit more about Cool Earth.
Oh, that's a big question. Okay, I'll try and keep it to half an hour. So Cool Earth, we've been going since 2007, and we launched with a very simple question. Saving the rainforest has been the slogan of the environmental movement for 50, 60 years. And the environmental movement, which I include, ourselves, hasn't done a great job of it. And we just wanted to ask why that was. So I spent a great deal of time talking to experts, academics in the US and Europe, but actually I spent a great deal of time in the Congo Basin, the Amazon, Papua New Guinea, really just trying to understand what worked on the ground. And the thing that really surprised me and all of us in the Cool Earth team is that when you look at the data and when you look at what works in terms of protecting trees, land that is under control of indigenous people and local communities is at least 5 times more likely to be kept standing in the short term. And short term is probably 20 years. Now that's versus reserves and protected areas and various other things that governments might be providing. Over the long term, it's probably off the scale in terms of how more effective it is, because so many commitments to keep rainforests standing are linked to political campaigns and particular governments. So if you think about what's happened in Brazil, with Lula moving to eventually Bolsonaro, there, a lot of the commitments made even 10 years ago are now, burnt as waste paper. And as a result, you need to recognize, how do we actually keep rainforests standing intergenerationally? And it has to be local communities, because they've been doing a good job of it for many, many generations. And they will be doing it for many generations in the future if they have the ability to withstand some very potent forces of destruction. And those forces of destruction are everything from mining to plantations to ranching, but also, of course, illegal logging. And one of the first things that Cool Earth did was talk to a community in central Peru, an Ashaninka community, who had been offered, I think, $10,000 for some of their mahogany trees and their cedars. And that seemed a lot, but it's probably something like 2% of their ultimate value when they get to market. But they were going to, take that money because there was no other game in town. It was a market failure. They had this, wonderful old growth rainforest, but the only way that they could actually put, food in their kids' tummies and also address, really high levels of malaria that they were suffering at those days was to get money from these loggers. We offered them less, but we said, we'll, keep on putting cash in a way that will just ensure that you're able to keep your forest standing. We didn't sign an agreement. We didn't demand, surety in any way. We just said, look, we'll provide what we can by raising funds in Europe and the US to put cash towards you. And that's pretty much what we've done for the last 15 years. Cool Earth has a presence in Europe because, the same reason that they rob banks, that's where the cash is. And we rattle the tin and we talk about what is happening on the ground, and that cash goes, and we take, as little as we possibly can to just keep the organisation going. And that proportion gets smaller and smaller and smaller, and more and more of it goes into rainforest communities each year. And this is such an essential act to address the climate crisis that we're delighted that people like Higson are supporting us, but we're also delighted that people like Higson are giving us the opportunity, Augustus, to talk about this in more detail, because it's a story that's seldom told. It's a story that is an essential piece of the jigsaw in addressing the climate crisis, and one that we're so proud to be a part of.
Absolutely. And what if other companies like Higson or other individuals are inspired and want to support Cool Earth? What can they do? And also, what results have you had so far? What are some of your success stories?
It's quite simple how you support us. You give us money and we will show you exactly how that's money spent. And we have a fantastic group of supporters that grow each year. And the thing that really delights us is that most of our corporate supporters who started working with us in 2008 are still supporting us now. And we have just wonderful partners across the globe who just realised that, if you want to have bang for buck and if you want to have an effective means of actually keeping forest standing, then Cool Earth has a very simple, effective model. So in terms of success, it's a really interesting one. And I'll be honest with you, real success is probably something we measure on decades rather than years. But we're delighted to say that if we look at just some of the communities we've been working with longest in Peru, then they're 3 to 4 times better forest outcomes, even than other indigenous communities in the area. If you compare it to non-indigenous communities, sometimes where people from far away have come in and started farming, then there's no forest left at all. So it's very, very impactful and very, very clear. But even more importantly, we've seen resilience grow in those communities. They have more choices because they have a bit of cash in reserve. They're able to evacuate, sick children to hospital, which sounds like a simple thing, but if it's a 10-hour trip down a river, then buying the petrol for that boat is a significant resource. They're able to buy mosquito nets. They're able to invest in their livelihoods. They're able to invest, in the future. And that's a key thing. All around the world, in so many different ecosystems, those ecosystems are destroyed when the people who live there have no choice and become marginalised. All Cool Earth is doing is to try and ensure that these extraordinary people do not face the marginalisation that will mean their communities deteriorate and disappear, and indeed the rainforest deteriorates and disappears.
That's one of the reasons that we at Higson love supporting Cool Earth, because it's very transparent with what you're doing. You can look at your accounts, you can see what's happening, and that impact feels so much greater than, lots of charities are doing amazing things. I think the thing that's amazing about Cool Earth is you've looked at the whole picture. you've looked at the individuals, the community, the forests, the carbon sinks. You've looked at all of it and connected it to a place that means that, as you say, bang for buck, you really feel like the money is having a really important impact, especially at the moment.
That's very kind. I'm sorry. I mean, so it's very kind of you to say that, Augusta. And to be honest, I think our message, I hope, got simpler. And the thing that we've learned over 15 years is that do less. Put cash into people's hands. Don't build them schools. Don't build casa comunales and, fresh water systems. Because in actual fact, if that's a priority and you give them cash, they'll do it themselves. And you'll have far better outcomes by moving money, which means moving dignity and moving leadership to the rainforest villages.
I mean, it kind of links back to employee engagement in UK businesses, really.
I knew we'd get there.
Yeah, the same issues everywhere. Why don't we kind of end with thinking about what have we got to be positive about as an individual, as a company, as a charity, as a country? What are you've got a few messages that how many did you say? 100 messages to be positive. What are one or two of those to end on that we can?
I think let's just boil it down to two messages to be positive. The first is we understand the science. I mean, it's been a long time that we've understood the science, but we understand it so well now. And we've got such smart people who have picked apart every part of the carbon cycle, every part of the gas industry and the oil industry and what EVs and photovoltaics will mean, etc. We just understand now what is causing the crisis. And that means we can understand the solutions. And therefore, the technical solutions, which I don't think need to be technological solutions. I think, we can talk about carbon storage and capture and all that, these, twinkle in the eye technologies, but we understand what we actually need to do with our industries and our homes and our transport systems. So that is a real positive. And I'm really encouraged each, day virtually by another outstanding bit of research coming out. And the fact that we have Johan Rockstrom, who's very much led this scientific revolution from the Stockholm Resilience Institute is a terrific asset for Cool Earth. The other thing, though, is the people who don't get it aren't going to be around as long as the people who do get it. And young people understand the issues, and young people are anxious and concerned, but they're also taking action. And that is hugely encouraging. And I just see that not just in amongst my own children and in communities in the UK, but right around the world. This is something that is a priority for us, but a huge priority for the generation coming up. And I think that is a huge positive. And it means that the politicians who are making 2050 commitments, and in 2050 when they'll be 80, 90, the people will actually be taking the action before then and forcing them to recognise that we need to pick up the pace are already coming through.
That's brilliant. Such positive messages. And it's so true. There are so many individuals who really care, are really intelligent, and really are pushing this forward. So there are a lot of things for us to be positive and excited about, as long as we all do take action from the individual, the company, and the government. Is there anything else that you think we should share?
We covered a lot of ground. I think we're probably good. No, I think you've been very comprehensive in your questions, Augusta, and I think we've covered everything.
Well, thank you so much. That was, as always, inspiring and amazing to speak to you, and always go away with a few things to go and look up and think about a little bit more. So thank you, and I'm sure.
Oh, it's a complete pleasure. And as I say, we're delighted to be working with Higson. You're a fantastic trainers, and you've been doing some pro bono training, which has made Cool Earth already a far more effective organisation. So we're tremendously grateful.
Oh, you're too kind.